Hello and welcome back to Cult Leader. I'm your cult leader, Spencer Henry. And this week, Cult Babes, you've been so good to me lately, I thought, hey, you deserve a bonus episode. So instead of doing our Little Leader segment for the week, we are going to be discussing a case that I've just been enthralled with this past week. Eating it up late night, scrolling, binging, the amount of time that I have spent on the newspaper archives, and don't picture I'm looking at newspaper archives online. I want you to picture I'm in a library, right? A big green library. There's like dark leather couches, and you just hear this like projector in the background, like I'm just scrolling through all the old papers. That's like the vibe I'm trying to give off, okay? This week, we're discussing a woman who was often referred to as the Nun of Death, though she's also made headlines being dubbed the female Rasputin, which you want to know about Rasputin, go listen. There's an obituary episode somewhere about them. But to her cult following, she was a saint. To those who escaped her wrath, she was a monster. And to the families of those who never made it out of her grip, she was downright diabolical. As is the case with most cult leaders, Mariam Soulakiotos promised her followers the ultimate eternal prize of salvation. As is also the case with most cult leaders, instead, what she delivered was torment, starvation, and moida. It's honestly insane to me how little this woman's name comes up in the cultosphere. I mean, I've been talking about cults for like what, 6 years now, and I'm just now learning her name. I think what makes her anonymity or elusiveness even more shocking is the fact that more than 150 people died after devoting their lives to her. Some say that number is closer to 500. Their crime? Blind faith. Their fate? A slow, agonizing descent into a maddening silence. This is the story of a woman who turned a monastery into a prison, faith into fear, and devotion into a death sentence. This is the story of Mariam Soulakiotos. To better understand this monster, we have to understand the woman that she was. Unfortunately, when it comes to Miriam's early life, there's not a ton of information out there. What we do know is that she was born in either 1883 or 1888. We don't know it for sure, but sources have alleged both years. I'm going with 1888 because that seems to be the more common one here. She was born in Greece, and by the early 20th century, she had committed herself to religious life. Prior to this religious breakthrough, she reportedly grew up working on farms and held a variety of different factory jobs, and seemingly comes from very humble beginnings. But everything changed in the year 1923, because that's the year Miriam met a monk named Father Matthew Carpathicus. Now, Matthew was a cult leader in his own right, and around the time the two of them were introduced, he was actually going through his own religious awakening or reckoning at the time. He was part of the Greek Old Calendarist Church. And this was actually really fascinating for me to learn about because I wasn't super familiar with this, and I'm going to try and simplify this as much as possible. But this was like the early 1920s, and essentially in Greece, the Orthodox Church decided that they were going to change their calendar, like where all their religious feast, everything was held. They'd been using the Julian calendar for like centuries, but then one day they're just like, this feels old school. And so they switched to a revised calendar, which matched up with the Gregorian calendar, which is like what the rest of the world uses. And it just made sense for them. Well, not everybody agreed. So some of the Orthodox Christians were like, this is terrible. Why the hell would you do this? It's a betrayal. Our religion's under attack, blah, blah, blah. The usual stuff. And basically they were like, this is blasphemy. We're not going to follow this new calendar. We're going to stick to our old calendar. Hence why this group of people became known as the Old Calendarists. And their whole thing after this calendar change was that they were pretty pissed off because they felt like the other Orthodox churches shifting to this new calendar was like them pushing away from their roots. And they felt like by going with the new calendar, everyone was just trying to fit in with Western Christianity and Catholicism and the Protestants. And some of the more conservative members straight up thought that the calendar change marked the impending doom of the Antichrist. So they sort of broke off into their own little sects, if you will, some moving off to remote areas. And as we know, when you combine ruralness, religious extremism, and blind devotion, we usually end up with disaster. Now, Matthew was one of these guys. He's the guy who's like, I don't want to go with the new calendar. And he's who introduced Miriam to the more extreme teachings of the old calendarists and the strict rules that they had to adhere to, such as forced fasting, sick people being denied medical assistance. Hello, faith healers, where you at? Prolonged prayer sessions. And when I say prolonged, I mean hours on end. We'll get more into the specifics, especially regarding physical abuse in a little bit, but that's just like the tip of the iceberg. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Miriam really rose to prominence in one of the offshoots that was started by Matthew, and essentially she becomes like the high priestess of his cult. There's some scandal here also, because it's been allegedly, that the two of them may have had a sexual relationship, or at least somewhat romantic situation going on, but we don't know for sure, and some historians claim that it's not super likely, given that there were heavily enforced rules regarding celibacy within the group. I mean, after all, he's like a monk, he's a father, and she had become a nun at this point. Although it would also not be the first time that cult leaders enforced rules that they refused to follow. There's always a little hypocrisy there. But regardless, the two of them had formed a very solid bond by the time Matthew passed away in 1939. Matthew was one of the few people in Mariam's early life who really saw something in her potential. Maybe it was her dedication to the cult. Maybe it was her ability to uphold influence over others. It makes perfect sense that when Matthew died in 1939, she took over as his successor. And that is how Mariam became a cult leader. She was now in charge of the monastery of Panagia Pevkophilousa, also known as the Convent of the Virgin in the Pines, which at first glance seemed like a place of peace, a refuge for those who were seeking salvation. Little did they know, once you entered, there was no way out. Although the group was already pretty much trained / coerced into obedience, if they thought having this woman come in would make things a little softer, a little more chill around there, they were dead wrong. Because the second Miriam stepped up to take over as their quote-unquote spiritual leader, she said, I'm not here to fuck around. Miriam transformed the monastery into something far more sinister. The rules they'd already been following seemed to intensify. And not only that, but she started getting even stricter about the followers communicating with anybody who wasn't in their cult. The group had largely flown under the radar up until Miriam took over, but as the membership number grew, so did the whispers that something strange was happening behind closed doors. The monastery, which, by the way, still exists today, is located in East Attica, about 30-ish miles, give or take, from Athens. But in addition to the monastery, prior to his death, Matthew had actually acquired 7 additional acres of land, and Miriam herself had secured them an additional 2 acres. And if you're wondering where the financial contributions to buy the land came from, well, long-time listeners, you already know. Short-time listeners, you could probably guess. It's pretty obvious, right? They were taking it straight from the hands of their followers because, hello, do you even want to achieve salvation if you aren't willing to fork over everything you've earned to your church? And we're talking everything. Obviously, all of the aforementioned land purchasing got people in town talking. It also didn't help the elusiveness that Miriam was always trying to control when word got out that a woman was leading a religious group either. Like, yes, she was a nun, but the fact that she was in the position she was and overseeing everything she was, it was pretty unheard of at the time. And it's also insane because, like, the reason they chose that location where this monastery is, it was pretty remote, very nature focused. It was because they initially started off as a convent that offered refuge for people suffering from tuberculosis, a place to receive free treatment. And it sounds great. Until you crack open those doors and realize they were, in fact, denying people medical assistance left and right, and quite literally cutting off any resources for them to ask for help. And then they were just sort of left to die after being squeezed out of every penny that they had to their name. Imagine you go and you're like, oh my God, I feel like shit. Thank God I can go to this place and they're going to help me out. And they're like, surprise, give me your money and you're getting nothing. And it's actually So diabolical. In order to ensure that they had money coming in at all times, Miriam would send some of the monks from the monastery out onto the streets, and they were literally instructed to go after wealthy spinsters, widows who had been left inheritances from their deceased husbands. And once they were brought into the convent, they were stripped of all their earthly possessions, their jewelry, their bank accounts, everything had to be handed over to Miriam. And it wasn't like they could object either. If you didn't want to give up the goods, yeah, no problem. But what's going to happen is you're probably going to get locked up in what was essentially a little jail cell and be starved until you agree to cooperate. One way or another, Miriam was getting that coin, and trust and believe that this went beyond wealthy widows. Although they were kind of the ideal buy-in for the group, Miriam was always on the hunt for new blood, and there was plenty of cases where young girls were essentially kidnapped and forced to dedicate their lives to this convent from hell. But that's when the rumor mills really started spinning because, surprise, sometimes when people disappear, their families come looking for them. As I mentioned, there were a lot of different rules you needed to follow if you wanted to be in Miriam's good graces. I mean, if you want to reach salvation. And one such rule was that there was no outside communication. So when people started joining, or were rather forced into joining, they were no longer able to have contact with the outside world. They couldn't write their friends or family, which ended up being a huge catalyst in the eventual downfall of Miriam's operation. At first, no one outside the monastery knew what was really happening behind those stone walls, but inside, it was a nightmare. Survivors have later described a strict hierarchy of suffering. Some women were treated as personal servants to Miriam, forced to wait on her hand and foot. Others were subjected to relentless physical and psychological abuse. Starvation was a very popular method of punishment. Gwen Shamblin, you're not original, babe. Women who disobeyed were locked in their cells for days, sometimes weeks, without food or water. And if you're thinking, hey, Spencer, that's not possible, somebody would die if they went weeks without food or water. Well, yeah, that absolutely happened. One woman who managed to escape later testified that she had been beaten daily for months. Another described being forced to kneel for hours, hands tied behind her back, while prayers were whispered over her as if she were already dead. And here's some additional rules they were forced to follow. Beatings with rods, sticks, or canes were common punishments for perceived disobedience. Followers who survived later came out with some pretty horrific recounts of their punishment. One survivor testified that Miriam personally beat her daily until she lost consciousness. Oh, and the whole prolonged prayer thing. We've talked about this before with some other groups, but these weren't just like all night prayer sessions. In these prayer sessions, followers were forced to kneel on hard stone floors for hours at a time. If you were under punishment, you might be forced to kneel on sharp objects like gravel or even sometimes grains of rice. You might have to hold a stack of books or heavy stone above your head until you collapse, or you might even be tied up, making the hours feel like days. These prayer sessions, along with these forced starvation, were obviously tactics that were rooted in control, right? We see this all the time with cults. And in addition to all of this fucking abuse that you're receiving, you might also be doing it on zero sleep. Whether this meant you were being forcefully kept awake at night or all of your bedding was removed. Some followers were forced to be imprisoned in these little cells that were like pitch black. There's no windows. You have no idea whether it's daytime or nighttime. You lose all sense of time. You didn't need to know what time it is. Miriam knew all. And this was an abuse, right? This was to be a better you, make you more obedient. If you want any chance at being saved, you must obey. And sometimes those little cells that I mentioned were extremely hot. Other months extremely cold, obviously depending on the time of the year, but followers would pass out sometimes just from the heat alone. And that's not all. That's just a glimpse at life at the convent. During the day, you were still expected to do a full workload. If you weren't a monk being sent out to snatch up elderly wealthy widows, you were a nun working overtime doing hard labor on the cult compound. Doesn't matter if you're tired that day. Doesn't matter if you're sick. There's no sick days here. Hell, in Miriam's eyes, exhaustion was no excuse. Your suffering brings you closer to God, a sentiment she often repeated. It's also pretty eerie to consider that the majority of your life on this cult compound was spent in silence. If you weren't being prayed over or punished, there's a good chance you were just working away or suffering in silence. And then there were the deaths. Many of the women who entered the monastery never left. At first, their disappearances were explained away. They'd gone into deep meditation. They'd passed away peacefully in their sleep. But as investigators would later uncover, many of these women didn't just die. They wasted away after experiencing deliberate neglect, untreated illnesses, slow and painful starvation. Life here was literally the furthest thing from an oasis, a place of refuge. One woman's story I saw come up, she's only ever been referred to as Miss Michelaku, was one of the victims who was suffering from tuberculosis, and she had actually come to the convent willingly to seek refuge in the monastery, which, as I mentioned earlier, had been advertising itself as a sanatorium of sorts. She, like many others who were looking for support, received no medical treatment. Instead, she was locked in a cell and she died, only, of course, after signing over all of her property to Mariam. And then there was the Baca family, a husband and wife who brought their 3 children to the monastery after being tricked into believing it was a place where they would find salvation. Instead, they found a house of horrors. When they first arrived, they were forced to sign everything over to Mariam. Come on, you gotta get rid of all your earthly possessions if you want to go to heaven. But after doing so, they were like, hey, maybe this isn't for us and our children. The facade dissipated pretty much the moment they set down their suitcases. People were sick, suffering, and sad, so they basically said, yeah, actually keep our shit. We're just gonna go if that's all right with you. But it was not all right with Mariam, as should be expected, right? This was the exact disobedience she was constantly warning her followers about. She immediately took Mrs. Baca to a cell where somebody had just died of tuberculosis complications, and she began starving her. Shortly after, Mrs. Baca herself became ill and passed away after a short-lived coma. Her husband, Mr. Baca, is alleged to have passed away shortly after his wife, meeting a similar fate, but I'm not sure whatever happened to the children. It was hard to translate some of the articles. But others, like Sister Maria and Sister Theodore, 2 nuns who were working on the property, were beaten to death during extreme punishment sessions. By 1950, the rumors surrounding the monastery were impossible to ignore. Families were demanding answers about their loved ones who had gone. And finally, the police launched an official investigation after a teenage girl was reported missing by her family shortly after joining the convent. What authorities found when they visited the monastery was beyond horrifying. There was just room after room filled with malnourished women who were too weak to move. Documents on the compound proving that estates had been fraudulently signed over. And most chillingly, unmarked graves scattered around the monastery grounds. Needless to say, Mariam was promptly arrested and would be facing several charges, but this was a really big case. There was a lot of eyes on it, and they needed to take a lot of caution when it came to arresting Mariam because they knew that some people weren't going to buy the whole evil nun thing, especially when they hadn't witnessed the atrocities firsthand. They didn't have proper evidence of all the murders, which, by the way, have been estimated to be between 150 and 500, but they did have evidence of embezzling, which they promptly charged her with. I also read that they got her on like a charge of exporting or importing olive oil illegally or something. Like they were basically just grasping here, right? They got to get her. Mariam was obviously arrested and charged with not only fraud, but false imprisonment, abuse, and manslaughter for the neglectful deaths. But in court, she remained defiant, claiming that she was a victim of religious persecution. I'm like, fucking save it, girl. Okay, you're a fuck-ass loser and you got caught. The evidence was overwhelming. Survivor testimonies painted a picture of systematic cruelty. There were financial records that proved millions had been siphoned from victims. And the graves, those graves told a story that nobody could deny. And best believe, the media, she was frenzied. Okay? Listen to this. This is from the Newcastle Sun, Thursday, December 2nd, 1954. This came after Mariam's, spoiler alert, death. It says, nuns starved, tortured in bogus convent. She was called the wickedest woman of the century. Her real name was Mariam Soulakiotos. But to Greece and European world, she will always be Mother Rasputin, the woman who perverted religion to make herself a fortune, who was responsible for the torture and starvation of nuns who made over property to her in return for eternal salvation. Her bogus convent was alleged to have made Mother Rasputin £50,000 in money, jewelry, and property. She and her collaborating priest at a nearby monastery were said to have caused the deaths of several hundred of the credulous. For years, until the arrest of Mother Mariam, as she called herself, in 1949, screams and groans had troubled the sleep of villagers living near the White Convent set high among the forested hills of Attica. But the convent began innocently enough as a result of a religious schism. In 1923, the Greek Orthodox Church decided to come into line with the rest of the world religious thought, which had centuries before adopted the Gregorian calendar of Pope Gregory XIII. A breakaway group calling themselves the Calendarists resolved to stick by the Julian calendar formula by Julius Caesar 45 years before Christ. One father, Matthew, took himself off to the hills of Attica to found his separatist group. Soon there arose nearby the convent, the Virgin in the Pines, and some years before the war came Mother Mariam. Mother Mariam became high priestess of the convent, a woman perpetually cowled in black, with her black currant eyes flashing from a face almost entirely covered. She organized agents all over Greece to search out those who were willing to be converted and wishing for eternal salvation. It was said at the first trial of Mother Mariam that there were young girls, elderly ladies, and even whole families who were drawn into her convent. The facade was finally smashed in 1949 when the police began to check on a Greek-born girl from the United States, Ileana Spirides, who was thought to have been taken to the convent. The police broke in, aided by howling peasants from the village. They found no trace of 18-year-old Ileana. Instead, in an underground cell, they discovered a 70-year-old woman, starving and emaciated. She was in chains, and her 4-by-7-foot cell was windowless. She had been living for weeks on dry bread and water as a penance. From there, police and the public prosecutor began to piece together a story of medieval fantasy coupled with 20th century fraud. They were told how sincerely religious people were coerced to the convent and immediately made to undergo 40 days fast of penance. There followed a week without sleep. At the end, the victim was promised eternal salvation and lasting peace, if all property was assigned over to the convent. Those who refused, it was claimed, were forced to take narcotic drinks and tortured. Silence was enforced, and those who spoke were beaten in the face with a shoe by Mother Mariam. Each time a nun died, it was said her relatives were told, "Sister blank is sleeping in Jesus Christ." Converts became brides of Christ and were told they were damned and guilty of moral adultery if they left. It was said that of 358 recent deaths, 55 were due to tuberculosis, and the public prosecutor said that over many years, 390 titles of land had been handed over to Father Matthew and Mother Mariam, as well as Sister Mendrinos, another one of the top guns of the top nuns. After her arrest in 1949, the female Rasputin was held in prison for almost 2 years while authorities sifted through the fantasy of her establishment. And then in September of 1951, she was sentenced to 26 months in jail for keeping a young girl in the convent and pretending to her relatives that the girl had died. The prosecution said that Mother Mariam hastened death by fast and penances. In February of 1953, Mother Mariam was brought from prison, this time to face another 23 charges. There's quite a few articles that came out around the same time that had pretty similar information in them. I mean, people couldn't get enough. But also, a lot of people didn't want to talk about it, I think because of all the religion that was tied here. What we do know about Mariam is that she would spend the rest of her life in jail. She never expressed remorse, never admitted guilt, and in 1954 she died behind bars, taking her secrets with her. But her legacy remains a chilling reminder of the dangers of blind faith and unchecked power. Hundreds of people lost everything because of her. Who knows how many more suffered in silence? Literally. How many more might have perished if she had never been caught? Faith can be a beautiful thing, but in the wrong hands, it could also be a weapon. And in the case of Mariam Soulakiotos, That weapon was wielded with deadly precision. On Friday, November 26, 1954, the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate published the following. Mother Mariam, 71, former abbess of a convent and leader of the outlawed calendarist sect, who was nicknamed the Woman Rasputin because of the alleged treatment of her nuns, died in a prison hospital. The calendarist sect was outlawed in 1951. It broke away from the Greek Orthodox Church in 1951. What a terrible legacy to leave behind. Apologies in advance if I butchered any of the names in this episode or there were any strange translations, but that is where we're going to leave it for the week. That is the story of Mother Rasputin, or the female Rasputin, or the evil nun. That's where we're going to leave it for the week. I will see you next time. And until next time, if you think hospitals are the scam, you're better there than Miriam's land. Goodbye.